This is Eric Pepke for Dead Man Video. This video is Justice is for Everybody, Not Just Lawyers. It was inspired by a lawyer reacts to video by Attorney Tom, and that was about another video about jury nullification. And I actually find these attorney reaction videos quite interesting in context and quite enlightening. But I also find the videos about the law, just by ordinary people, also to be very interesting and very valuable. Since I'm going to be maybe interpreted as criticizing a lawyer, I want to say that with the notable exception of federal prosecutors, whom I hate and think are a waste of perfectly good carbon that could be used in briquettes, I really do like lawyers. I think they bring a lot of information to the table. But what they say is limited, and this is not an insult. They go to school because they're interested in some aspect of the law, and then they focus on a particular aspect of the law. And the law is so huge that they have to spend all their time learning about this one particular aspect, and other things, even about the law, just kind of get pushed out of their conscience and consciousness. But I think conscience is also applicable here. They're a little bit like physicians who have to study so hard just learning all this stuff that they don't have a lot of time to do anything else. And I also appreciate that lawyers are extremely overworked and there's so much to do. And I've never known anybody who got into lawyering because of the money primarily. Sometimes physicians will do that, but lawyers inevitably have some principles that they want to devote their lives to. And there are a very few lawyers who actually do that significantly throughout their lives. One is Harvey A. Silverglate, who told me in a letter that he thought it was an important lawyerly duty to respond to each and every letter he got from a prisoner. I don't think a lot of lawyers think that or hold that as ethics, but I'm certainly glad he did. And I know I go on and on and on in my letters, and there's way too much to read. Fortunately, now I've discovered that going on and on in YouTube videos that nobody watches is a lot easier than writing letters that nobody reads. So I'm doing that instead, inasmuch as I am permitted to do under supervised release. Now, as my other videos show, I am fighting a wrongful conviction because I am actually innocent. Now, I don't have any motivation at all to convince you that I'm right, because there's nothing you could do to help me. The only thing anybody could do to help me would be to help me not die on the streets as an insulin-dependent diabetic, and I'm not even allowed to start a Patreon page under pain of going back to prison. And so that's probably not going to happen. But I do need to vent, because I am doing this alone, and especially in prison, I was doing it alone, because there's really no options for any help out there. There are organizations you probably think do that, and you probably give money to, but they're very, very, very limited in the things they can do. And some, like the ACLU, really isn't interested in doing anything that doesn't fit their ideological biases. This happened about 20 years ago. They used to be a great organization. They are the opposite of a great organization. There's some organizations that are good, like the Center for Constitutional Rights. They have a little booklet that they send to prisoners for free that tells them about the law and how to fight prison conditions. But they have typically a budget of $8 million or $8 million incoming, whereas the ACLU could get close to $200 million. The CCR does the kind of things that the ACLU used to do, but doesn't anymore. Enough of that. So I don't want to give the impression that I am down on Attorney Tom or any of these lawyers who give really valuable information for free. Of course, they're given free advertising, so that's all right too. I don't have any objection to that kind of a thing, as long as the videos are good, and mostly they are. But I want to go back to my experience. Fighting this alone is not easy. It is intensely painful. I had to become an autodidact and try to figure out as much law as I can. These are a couple of stacks of case law, federal case law I've analyzed, about 100 cases. These are all from prison. They are the tip of the iceberg. They are simply what I was able to carry out of prison. But I had an absolute need just to reduce the pain in my brain by venting and by telling these things to people. Now, I used to believe that there were human beings that were capable of being friends. I think that that is almost completely untrue. Unlike dogs are pretty good at being friends. Human beings are terrible at it. All of my friends, the people I considered friends, just abandoned or betrayed me, or both, fairly soon after I was imprisoned. I was able to get a small number of pen pals, mostly Jewish, through various connections that I had, which were not very good, and I worked very hard at that. And a thing would happen, and it's not that difficult to tell that somebody else is in pain. And it's not that difficult, especially with a letter, which you don't even really have to read thoroughly. You could just scan it and think, this guy's in pain and needs some, at least, acceptance or appreciation for this. Because it's not that hard. You could say, oh, I don't understand what you're saying. But it sounds like you're going through a rough time, and I want you to know that I'll be your friend anyway, and I can't give you any advice, really, because I don't know. I mean, how hard is that? But nobody did it. Well, with one notable exception, but that was very late in my prison career. What would happen is I would write things just trying to have a sounding board, or even not having a sounding board, just trying to say it, instead of just write them down and knowing that they were at risk of being stolen by the prison guards. And they were about this incredible frustration and pain that I had trying to do this on my own. And I just wanted to be able to believe that there was somebody who, they didn't even have to care about what I was saying. They just had to care about me as a human being, or at least accept me as a human being. Because once you're in prison, nobody thinks of you as a human being. But what would happen is I would talk and there would be no response, or it would be about something like puttering around in the garden or baseball. And I'm sure baseball is fascinating to a lot of people, but I don't get into watching other people play sports. I play some myself, but it's not an all-consuming activity for me. I just wanted to be able to let off steam, to vent, to rant a bit. And so they would basically ignore this, and then eventually I'd get that kind of a letter. And it always said, "I am not a lawyer." And what does that have to do with anything? I never thought you were a lawyer. I never expected you to be a lawyer. And so it gives me the impression that people think that justice and the law, which is almost entirely opposed to justice, is kind of an icky lawyer thing. And lawyers are like the Roto-Rooter guy, or the guy who picks up your garbage, except less visible and less empathetic. And you've got a filthy job, and you pay a lawyer a lot of money to do it for you. And it's not something you would ever do yourself in a billion years. And this is terrible. And the reason it's terrible is because we're supposed to be in a somewhat democratic society. The first three words of the Constitution are not "we the lawyers," or "we the politicians," or "we the judges." They are "we the people." And it is very important for you, the people, to be involved, to be interested, at least not to shun the whole ugly sausage-making process of the law. I quite agree that it is filthy and disgusting and reprehensible, and no sane person would want to do it. Well, except lawyers. They find it fascinating. I certainly don't enjoy it in any way. And I really wish that I could live in a universe where I didn't have to worry about it. But you live in a universe where you have to worry about it. Because if you don't worry about it, it happens to you. And what happens is bad. Okay, so that's a little bit of evangelism. I know it won't work, but I have to vent about this too. So most of the very few people who listened to me or accepted my letters at all, even though it was an extreme burden for them, were lawyers. There's Harvey Silverglate, who is, I think, at the top of the heap, but there was 3 people at the Due Process Institute, mostly Jeremiah Mosteller, who was a real mensch, Devin Unger, and of course the founder and alpha, who was Chanatera O'Toole. Occasionally I'd get something nice. And the things that were nice, like from Harvey, were not, he never gave me legal advice, and it would violate my ethical system to ask him for legal advice. But just the little tiny things that he said, the off-the-cuff comments, and also his editorials were very interesting. They're on the WGBH website, most of them, and you can look them up yourself. They're actually quite challenging. He's a liberal, but he holds, most important, the basic principles of justice, which are very important. Maybe I'll get to some of the things he told me. But I wanted to say that the basic way people approach lawyers, and that probably includes YouTube lawyers, is fundamentally misguided. So now I'm going to go back to the one statement that triggered this. They're talking about jury nullification, and that's not something judges are encouraged, and most courtrooms, maybe all courtrooms, have rules that a jury cannot be told about this stuff. There are several court cases where judges actually did very circuitously, and I respect those judges tremendously. But they try to find out when you go to voir dire or dire or something like that, which is when they question the jurors to decide whether they kick you out because you're too smart. They can't even say, will you nullify? They say, do you have any beliefs that might prevent you from making a decision based strictly on the law? And Attorney Tom said, yeah, that's exactly what we ask. And I think I can conclude that Attorney Tom doesn't realize how utterly heinous this question is, because that's just what they do. They're trained to do that. They get used to do it. And based strictly on the law is the core of how it's been, of how heinous it is. That's because strictly on the law is against justice. And that has been true historically. And the idea that we just have juries doing things based strictly on the law is a recent American invention, and it has become so embedded in the system that we don't even see how horrible it is. In fact, justice was historically and is ideologically opposed to the law. So now I'm going to go through a little vastly oversimplified summary of the history of justice. And obviously I can't do all of it. You probably know that some of it goes back to the Torah. Some of it goes back to the Code of Hammurabi. Some of it had very different approaches to justice in different cultures. So I'm going to focus on English common law. And 49 out of 50 states are based on English common law. The exception is Louisiana, which is based on something French. But 49 states are based on English common law. The federal government is not based on English common law at all, excepting only times when the judges feel like whipping it out of an orifice to justify something that they already decided they wanted to justify it to make it appear rational. And that's really true. And you have statements from judges and justices that there is no general federal common law. The Bill of Rights was an attempt to inject some common law into the canon, and it's largely failed. There are so many exceptions to every amendment that we might as well just not have them. So let's go back to history, and I'm going to go back to the feudal period in England about, after the Norman Conquest, about 1066. But you could go back a little earlier than that as well. The ancient justice systems were in the British Isles were based on clans, basically hugely extended families, and they had people whose job it was to do that sort of thing, and they were respected members of the community. Unlike now, appropriately, we should disrespect judges, but that's what they did. And then there was the Romans came in, and the Romans had law. And it was based on sort of an interesting idea that you wrote down law. But this was never really taken very seriously. In fact, Julius Caesar issued proclamations, the law, and he posted them publicly, but on top of towers so high that nobody could read them. That was considered convenient because people couldn't avoid breaking the law because they didn't know what it was. And that practice continues, especially at the federal level today. Dick Durbin is a huge fan of it, and the rationale seems to be that in order to appear to be against Wall Street fat cats, you have to have a lot of laws that they don't know about and can't understand so that you could do a gotcha. Now, Dick Durbin is a smart guy. He must know that this almost never gets any Wall Street fat cats. He must know that it gets hundreds of thousands of innocent people, most of them black, let's be honest about that. But he is in favor of this because it gets him votes. And people don't think about that. That's another reason ordinary people should think about the law. So let's go back to the history. Basically, the clan system got big, and you had people coming in, and then you had the French and the Norman conquest, and the way to get power politically was to kill a bunch of people and then take over and then kill a bunch more people. And this was the law. The law was the opinion of the person, usually a man, sometimes a woman, who was the government. That was the law. When we say strictly on the law, that's what we mean. King says so, king can kill you, king gets his way, period. So the only thing that's really saved us from what George Orwell described as a boot stamping on a human face forever was that dynasties, as you will, with the English pronunciation, were maintained by inheritance and nepotism and a lot of inbreeding, because they wanted to keep it all in the family. And this caused some problems because you couldn't guarantee that your offspring were as vicious mass murderers as you were. And some of them got kind of dingy in the head and became a little bit weaker. And there were other forces in society. There were the nobles, and there was the church. Commoners really didn't matter to anybody except for that, wacky Christian idea based on the teachings of Rabbi Ben Yosef, Rabbi Yeshua Ben Yosef of Nazareth, who his name got changed to Jesus for some reason by the Romans. The idea that people are equal and valuable and you shouldn't go around killing them all the time and doing nothing else. But largely, the royalty didn't care about commoners. But you had the nobles and you had the church, and they were struggling for power. And this was called the separation of powers. The idea that you could do that by having judiciary, executive, and legislative separated by powers was an American idea. And it was really, it's a complete failure, obviously, because they're all working for the same people. They're all on the same side, especially at the federal level. Anyway, the church was particularly bothered by having all of their parishioners get slaughtered every couple of years. And they started a concept which they called the courts. And these were, in many countries, frequently it was called a chancellery, or run by a chancellor. And they had lawyers and they had judges. And this is why lawyering is called a profession. Originally, it was a profession of faith, and it was one of the jobs controlled by the church. And there are only a couple of others. There's academia, which I was in, and there's medicine, which, well, doctors are in. And of course, there's the clergy. These are the original professions. The idea of profession as something you make money of was that's a bastardization of the concept of a profession. Now, even to this day, English lawyers and judges have these robes that they never wear, and they have little pockets on the back, and so they could turn their back discreetly and someone could deposit a fee. And the last I heard, which was a couple decades ago, a lawyer still cannot in England sue a client for non-payment. And so these are obviously church values, charity and stuff like that. So the justice was not really part of the law. Justice was a part of another thing called equity. And equity is kind of a funny word that's hard to figure out. It basically doesn't mean the money in your home. It means fairness. It means justice. It means decency. Now, this dates back to something that we Jews have, and it's in a book that you probably call Deuteronomy, and we usually do too because we forget the names. And it's tzedek, tzedek. And that's usually translated as justice, justice. In the term justice, justice, will you follow? But my interpretation of it is that, well, Hebrew, like English, you could use a noun as an adjective, and what it means is just justice. Then that means, I think, that the process of justice has to be just. And this is where originally, perhaps, we get the idea of due process and rights of the accused and jury trial and all of these things. It's to ensure that justice cannot be used by the dictator or king to impose purely arbitrary decisions, that there must be some fairness. Well, of course, the monarchy doesn't like that and didn't like that. And in the feudal era, where commoners were slaves called serfs, they were a property of the monarch. You know, the monarch didn't want to be bothered by any of this stuff. And there's also a thing that continues to this day, which is called sovereign immunity, and that means you can't sue the king, you can't sue the government, unless the government gives consent, and that's a serious problem at the federal level. The 11th Amendment, they introduced it so that states couldn't be sued because they owed a lot of money for the Revolutionary War, but the courts have just sort of said, let's do it to the federal government anyway. You know, it's, why not? Why not? We don't want to be sued, right? So we'll say you can't sue us. It's probably a fairly dangerous thing because when you can't sue people, you tend to do other things like drive-by shootings, which happened a lot during Prohibition. When you can't take somebody to court in a civil way to resolve your disputes, well, you go back to killing them, which is what the monarchs used to do and what the government does, because government can effectively be defined as the use of violence to maintain a monopoly on violence. So the churches set up the courts, and they heard cases based on equity, and they challenged the king, and they sometimes won. And this goes back to at least back to the reign of Henry VII. And there were some writs before this one. This one was habeas corpus, and it was codified in the 17th century in England. And habeas corpus went on for a very long time, and then the government in 1949 decided they didn't like it at a federal level, and they introduced Section 2255. And then later on, the courts decided they didn't like the prohibition of using mens rea and habeas corpus at the federal level, so they got rid of that. And then the Supreme Court in the early 90s decided that they didn't like habeas corpus either, and so they made it very, very hard. And then little Willie Clinton decided he really didn't like habeas corpus and completely gutted it. And that's true to this day. Some states still have habeas corpus, but the federal government only pretends to have habeas corpus, because in the Constitution you're not allowed to suspend habeas corpus except in cases of insurrection or rebellion when it's required. Lincoln got a lot of flack for doing that for a couple of years. But unfortunately, the framers of the Constitution only thought that someone would try to suspend it. They didn't imagine that people would gut it, which was very stupid on their part. So let's go back to the law. So we have these arbitrary decisions by kings, and they're fought by somewhat more just and fairer opposition by the church. And the nobles were in there too, but it gets very, very complex when you talk about the nobles versus the monarch. So eventually, the Spanish Reconquista opened up the Library of Toledo, and they discovered a bunch of books that religious fanatics had destroyed most of the copies, but at Toledo, some of the copies survived, and they got it circulation. They got circulated in Europe, and that started the Renaissance. And during the Renaissance, a lot of people discovered old Greek and Roman ideas and said, hey, that sounds kind of cool. And then we had what was called the Enlightenment and rationalism, and that was in the 17th century, pretty much spurred on by René Descartes, and that's been a pretty massive failure. But it was historically important, and the basic idea was, we're all rational beings. Yeah, right. And so all we have to do is we have to take all these ideas and write them down and apply them rationally and logically and with reason, and everything's going to be okay. Didn't work out. Well, back before that, there was a thing called the English common law, and it was basically what happened was a bunch of people, a lot of them influenced by the church and chancellery, went around and tried to figure out what people were doing and decided to write them down. And there were various principles that they came up with. They were trying to make a law that resembled what people thought was just. Hasn't happened recently, but they did it back then, and they came up with some principles. And one of the principles was the exception proves the rule. And I've seen a lot of YouTube videos and read a lot of stuff that completely gets that wrong. It's really the exception proves the rule in things not accepted. For example, if you see a sign that says no parking Sundays, which is a rule, you can infer that you can park on all the other days, that even though the sign doesn't say you can. And so they constructed ideas of rights and practices and due process based on this stuff called common law. And the common law was maintained primarily by judges in case law. And the case law used, precedent, another thing that doesn't really happen unless the judges feel like it. And also, what do they say? Comity, which is spelled with a T. I sometimes refer to the Supreme Court as Comedy Central. And that's the idea that you should respect what some other judge has done and try to make it the same. And we have res judicata and stare decisis and all of these things that we're not supposed to, res judicata is not supposed to apply to habeas corpus. Of course, it thoroughly does at the federal level right now. And when this Enlightenment craze of writing things down and pretending you could be logical about it happened, they decided to write these things down, especially in the United States, where we have a written constitution, the oldest written constitution in the world, and one of the few, perhaps the only one, that does not mention God at all. England, they say they have a constitution, but it's an oral constitution, basically a gentleman's agreement, very approximate, very much based on experience and common law. But the founders had this idea, these Enlightenment ideas, that you could just write stuff down. So they wrote a constitution, and that has become the law. So when you're talking about strictly on the law, it's really not so much the Constitution, because the judges have changed that violently. And strictly on the law is against justice. You're just supposed to follow the rules and come to the conclusion. If it says this is bad, you have to convict. Blah, blah, blah. There's no variation. Now, this guy, Attorney Tom, is a civil lawyer, and so he's focused on civil law, and he criticizes the other videos for not saying much about civil law. But there are a certain number of things about criminal law that, especially at the federal level, that do make it important to talk about this. First of all, as Attorney Tom talks about, he asks about, would you award millions of dollars to this? And the only reason that's relevant is because the jury does have something to do with the award. In at least a federal criminal trial, the jury doesn't have anything to do with sentencing. They are usually kept ignorant of what the sentencing should be, and they are frequently told that they have to make their decision based only strictly on the law and not consider sentencing. Federal sentencing is highly, highly, highly problematic. The sentences are much more severe, generally, for low-level crimes than the states have for very, very serious crimes. So you can commit an extremely violent crime at the state level and go to prison for 2 or 3 years, and you can get out and re-enter easily and nobody cares. You don't have to do much more than pick your nose at the federal level to be convicted of a much more to be convicted and sentenced to much, much longer than you would get for killing somebody or raping a child or something really terrible at the state level. And this is fundamentally unjust. You're also, when in a criminal case, and especially a federal criminal case, dealing with with an adversary that has essentially unlimited power. You have pretty much nothing. Especially true of the federal government, because the federal government just has to borrow more money from China to pay for stuff, and they are extremely vicious. And the reason they're vicious is because, unlike the states, they don't have to care what happens after they get their pound of flesh. The states at least are motivated to do something to have less crime, because crime costs them money. Crime doesn't cost the federal government money, because the way it works is that if a state, the federal government gains its power and gains its jurisdiction politically by being more aggressive than the states. When the federal government releases somebody, the person doesn't go back to a federal enclave somewhere that the federal government has to care about. The person goes back to the states. So any effects of imprisonment or the criminally unjust system at the federal level, they have to be borne by the states. And if the states can't handle it, that's good for the federal government, because then they can sweep in like Mighty Mouse and say, look how we protect you. You states, you're not as powerful as us. We have to come in. You are clowns. So give us more jurisdiction. And the people do. So that's another reason to consider federal criminal more important than civil, which is mostly at the state level, because, as I said with sovereign immunity, the ability to sue the federal government is extremely limited. Maybe I'll do another video about that nobody will watch. Another reason to be concerned with federal criminal law is, well, there's the politics. Obviously, we know from John Ehrlichman spilling the beans a few years ago that the war on drugs was simply a lie by the Nixon administration to oppress the left and black people. It was a hugely successful campaign. People polled didn't really think drugs were much of a problem until Nixon got on the PR bandwagon and said it's public enemy number one. And of course, public enemy one was the anti-war left and black people. The other reason is the sheer number of people imprisoned in mass incarceration at the federal level. And that there are very, very few organizations that deal with the federal level. Most of them are, most of the justice organizations are local. They'll do Washington, D.C., and maybe Maryland if you're lucky, or they'll do Los Angeles. And people don't really care about it because of the way you can lie with statistics. You could point out that total, there are more people imprisoned by the states than the federal government. And this is true, but it's irrelevant, because unless you simultaneously live in all 50 states at once, you don't have to care about other states' criminal stuff, criminally unjust behavior. You only have to focus on your own state. And the federal government in total is imprisons more people than any one state, even the biggest, which I think is California. And also the federal government, federal laws affect you no matter what state you live in. Also, because there is no federal common law, you don't have the protections. One of the protections is called mens rea, which means that you can't be convicted unless you intentionally and knowingly do something wrong, or knowingly and intentionally violate the law. You can be convicted easily. See Dick Durbin again for doing something without being aware of it at all, until you find out sometimes. Now, many federal statutes have no mens rea at all. Some have the statute. Some statutes only have, you have to know that you've done it, which you can find out after the fact. As soon as you know you did something, even if it's completely accidental, you're guilty. You have no protection because there's no federal common law, and federal laws are creatures of statute only. Well, I have so much to say that it would take hundreds, if not thousands, of hours to say it, and I have to stop somewhere. And so I'm stopping now. This has enough information, I think, probably that nobody knows. Nobody knew before this, before watching this video. And probably most people won't know it after either, because of this incredible resistance to the ickiness of the law, which according to cognitive science gets right there in your brain and causes you to reject stuff. But maybe there's a little crack. Maybe if you don't agree with me and you don't like me, maybe you even hate me, maybe you reject everything I say, and you don't want to read because you know for a fact what the facts are. Maybe this will stick around in your brain, and tomorrow or next week or next year, you'll see something in the newspaper. Now, of course, the poltroons of the press try to avoid telling you these things, but accidentally some information comes by. Maybe that will trigger a kind of a brainstorm, cascading, neurons firing as ions travel down the axons to the synapses. Not something you might want to have happen, not something most Americans want to have happen, but it happens anyway, and you might flash on something and get interested in it. This is pretty much the only hope that I have, and I don't run on hope, but I do run on venting. And if nothing else, I feel a little better, even if you don't. Take care.